John Decker is a member of the White House Press Corps since 1995, covering the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations. John is one of Washington's most experienced political journalists and the only lawyer in the press pool. So John, thanks for joining us today, and the screen is yours, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you to all the Nordic AmChams, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. It's great to be back with you. It's a real honor to be back with you, and it's hard to believe that our last virtual session was just back in June, and so much has indeed happened since June of this year, and we have a lot to look forward to in 2021 in many respects. What I want to do is to just have a few slides to take us back through what happened in this just concluded presidential election, but more importantly for you and all of the AmCham members that are watching, to take a look ahead to see what we can expect from the incoming Biden administration. And of course, I'd be more than happy to take any of your questions concerning any part of the presentation, as well as anything that maybe is on your mind as it relates to the incoming administration. So let's take a look back, first of all, at the results of the 2020 election and how we got to where we are right now. Let's move on to the next slide. So in order to understand 2020, we have to understand what happened in 2016. And what happened in 2016 is that President Trump managed to thread the needle in terms of winning the presidency. He turned a number of states that are traditionally states that vote for the Democratic nominee, managed to turn them from blue to red, including the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those three states really are the reasons why Donald J. Trump was elected in 2016. He ended up with 306 electoral votes, Hillary Clinton 232, and this is what President Trump.
I think we lost the audio there for a moment. John, is your microphone still on, right? We might have to get John logged in again. You cut out on us there for a moment.
See any slides? Can everyone else see them?
Yes, I can see them. Somebody cannot see them?
That's Barbara. Yeah, I can't see them.
I can see them.
I can see them.
Maybe I'll log on again. Okay, thanks.
But we need to get John back on, so I don't know if somebody has a chance to call John. It looks like he might be having to log in one more time.
I can call him, Steve.
Thank you. Stick with us, everybody. Just a minor technical glitch.
I was going to say,
go ahead.
Steve, while your team is getting John back on the call, and this is a great reminder actually that these kind of technical glitches, they still happen a couple months in. It's just one of those things. But it's so funny when John pulled up this map and I was looking at it, and it really was such an incredible election, looking at all that red, especially when you compare it to the 2020 results, which was this slower landslide. It's such a funny perspective also, because 2016 now, especially given what we've been through this year, seems like a very long time ago, but really it was just 4 years.
That's right. That's exactly right. So, and also it's interesting that the numbers are completely flipped this time around, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So, but different states. So it's just interesting how many different combinations you can get to those numbers, right?
Yeah. And while we're getting John back on the call, this is a great opportunity for everyone listening in to start thinking about those questions. I know for a fact that there are a couple US people who specifically follow US studies, and John is, as you know, very experienced. So if there are questions or things that you've been wondering about or that you've gotten asked, and you're just looking for a different perspective, whether he brings it up in his presentation or not, now's a great opportunity to take those couple minutes just to jot down what you want to be asking him.
Good point. Good point.
I will Can you see me or hear me?
I can hear you. We just can't see you yet.
Here, I'll turn off my camera and see if the bandwidth.
Is that I seem to.
Got you back.
Good.
Welcome back, John.
Good. Good to be back. Good to be back. Wow, that was a little bit of a scare. Well, in any case, we're back, and we didn't miss much. We can get right back to it. This was the 2016 electoral map, and I explained why it is that President Trump won. He managed to flip states that traditionally had been blue, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, managed to turn them red, and this is what he was trying to hold on to back on November the 3rd. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So interestingly enough, it's the same turnout as far as the electoral score is concerned, 302 to 232, but this time Democrats had 306 and Republicans had 232. And one of the primary reasons was those three states that I mentioned, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. They flipped back to where they were traditionally. Pennsylvania before 2016 had not voted for a Republican for president since 1988, since George H.W. Bush. 1984 was the last time before 2016 that Michigan had voted a Republican for president. And for Wisconsin, it was also 1988. That was the last time before 2016 that Wisconsin had voted for a Republican for president. But in 2020, what the Biden campaign was able to do was to really turn out the vote. They turned out their supporters in ways that were not there for Hillary Clinton 4 years prior. And one of the takeaways that we can get from the 2020 election is that suburban voters in particular provided the margins for President-elect Biden in those three particular states. The suburbs of Philadelphia went overwhelmingly for Joe Biden. The suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, and also the suburbs in many parts of Wisconsin, including Madison, Wisconsin, also, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, also went for Joe Biden. That provided a lot of the difference, as did Black voters who came out in greater numbers for the Biden-Harris ticket than they did for Hillary Clinton just 4 years prior. Two other states in this election also flipped, which surprised a lot of people, including me. I had Joe Biden winning this particular election, but I did not foresee that Joe Biden would be able to flip two states that, again, had traditionally been red, one being Georgia and the other one being Arizona. Those were two states that Joe Biden managed to eke out a victory. 12,000 votes is how much Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won Georgia by. There were 3 recounts in the state of Georgia. The vote's been certified there. The vote has been certified in Arizona, another state in which there was a small margin of victory on the part of the Biden-Harris ticket. But when you look at what happened here, it's a pretty remarkable victory in terms of the Electoral College. President Trump, 4 years ago, described his victory as an electoral landslide, 306 to 232. And if we use the president's words that he used 4 years ago, I guess this too was an electoral landslide, 306 to 232. Let's go on to the next.
Hey, John, quick, I'm going to just come in with a quick question. Maybe just go back to that slide, Elizabeth.
Sure.
Number one, still, you know, the election was in these states was very close, and I think you anticipated that. But there's also a question from the audience. You know, a former Swedish prime minister made an analysis saying that in the modern economy, new companies thriving with businesses is located in democratic areas. Any comments to that? Do you find that true, or and what does this mean for American economy if those businesses are located in democratic areas?
Well, I look at the sector in particular, and you know, you have some AmCham members that are involved in the auto industry, and you look at the U.S. plants for European automakers. They're not located in democratic states, and in fact, they're located in red states that have right-to-work rules. There are no unions. That's the reason why they've been based there. So Mercedes, for instance, is based in Alabama. BMW has their plant based in South Carolina. These are red states. You also have some Japanese automakers that are based in Tennessee. These are red states. These are states that are traditionally run by Republican governors and have Republican legislatures. So as it relates to the auto sector, you can see where I'm going. Other multinational companies, it may be different, but you know, I focus on where trade is pretty significant between the U.S. and Europe, and the U.S. and Asia, and you can see what the situation is there. I'd have to read the specific points that were made by the former Swedish Prime Minister to get a sense as to what, you know, types of points that he's making. But you know, that's my read on it.
Yeah, I think the question being asked, I think he was asking more about like new companies and startups and, you know, kind of thriving businesses. And I don't know, Peter from Sweden, have you heard of anything from your Prime Minister about that?
No, I've not.
Okay.
Not heard anything from the current Prime Minister, and I haven't seen these the comments from the former Prime Minister.
All right, John, go ahead and move forward. Then we'll catch other questions as they come.
Sure. Well, you know, these three states, you know, if we break it down a little bit, you know, go into the details here, you can see what happened in 2016. And President Trump won Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan by less than 1% of the vote. That's what I meant when I said threading the needle. 44,000 vote victory margin in Pennsylvania, almost 23,000 vote victory margin in Wisconsin, and in Michigan, a little over 11,000 votes. So that's barely winning, but he did it. He managed to win the states where he needed to win to get to 306. And that is the challenge that he faced in 2020, holding on to these three states, maintaining the, you know, the focus on these three states. And you can see what happened 4 years later. And the Trump Pence ticket was unable to do that. And you see Pennsylvania. The margins actually increased. I put this particular slide together, I would say 2 weeks out from November the 3rd, and the vote totals were still being counted. So it's a little bit more than 66,000, but you get the idea. Completely flipped the state. And again, that's because of the suburban vote. It's also because of black voters in the Philadelphia area coming out in large numbers for the Biden-Harris ticket. Wisconsin, that's a state in which there was a recount that was done. The recount was done in two particular counties. That was at the request of the Trump campaign. Interestingly enough, if you find this kind of thing interesting, they spent $3 million to pay for that recount. And the recount actually ended up with more votes going to Joe Biden in the recount. So Joe Biden actually gained votes because of that recount in those two particular counties that were recounted. The Biden-Harris ticket winning Wisconsin by a little over 20,000 votes, and Michigan, wow, look what happened in Michigan. What a turnaround from an 11,000 vote plus margin for the Trump-Pence ticket to over 147,000 vote margin for Biden-Harris in 2020. And there are a number of factors besides the suburban vote, besides the black vote in Detroit. At the time the vote was taken, it still exists. COVID's really bad. And COVID, from everything that I've heard when I speak to advocates for both campaigns, campaign workers in all three states, they told me that the COVID problem was so rampant in Wisconsin and Michigan, in particular the Midwest, that it really impacted the way that voters viewed the Trump administration, and they're dealing with the COVID pandemic. And you see the results. I mean, this is a state that even though the Trump campaign legal team challenged the results in actually all 3 states, all of those legal efforts were ultimately defeated and ultimately blocked. In fact, the Supreme Court decided to reject an appeal from the Trump campaign yesterday as it relates to the vote totals in Pennsylvania. So on December the 14th, the Electoral College will actually meet in each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, and it will be official. I think it already is essentially official, but Joe Biden will be the president-elect and will be America's 46th president. Let's go on to the next slide.
A quick question from Peter.
Just one question about the certification. One question, and also to clarify, I've now learned from our member Mullen, who asked the question about the economy. It's from former Prime Minister Reinfeldt's book, which I haven't read, but I have heard him comment on it. And I think he was specifically talking about the economic drivers primarily in tech on the West Coast, like Silicon Valley, Washington State, and then also the East Coast, the Northeast in particular. But the question I had about the certification is one that it's a question that we get a lot, and actually I think there's one in the feed here about like the recounts in Georgia. But as you mentioned, the states are going to certify on the 14th. Yesterday was the safe harbor deadline for states to certify. But then in early January, Congress will convene to sort of tally the Electoral College votes and officially choose the president or certify the president-elect as the new president. And there are news reports that some Republican lawmakers, I'm thinking about Mo Brooks from Alabama, maybe there's others who are considering challenging that in the House. Is that realistic, and is that something that could actually change the outcome?
Well, it's a great question, Peter, and I'm glad to see that you're, reading up and following what's happening in such, minute detail here in the U.S. Mo Brooks is a Republican congressman, a loyalist to President Trump. He says that he will challenge the votes once Congress has their say on it on January the 5th of 2021. Actually, 4 years ago, you had Democrats actually doing the same thing with President Trump. You had some far-left Democratic congressmen that challenged the vote totals of President Trump in winning the 2016 election. In order for this process to go forward, though, you'd have to have not just a congressman or congresswoman challenge the vote. You'd have to have that congressman or congresswoman partner up with a U.S. senator. And that didn't happen 4 years ago. No U.S. senator partnered up, no Democratic U.S. senator partnered up with the Democratic congressman or congresswoman to challenge the results and move this to the point where you have the full House and the full Senate voting on essentially certifying the vote totals. As it relates to 2020, will a Republican senator partner up with Mo Brooks, for instance? I would say 100% no. And I say that because the number 2 Republican in the U.S. Senate, Peter, his name is John Thune. He is the number 2 Republican, Mitch McConnell. He record, this won't happen. And Republicans, they fall in line. They listen to their leaders. And when you have the number 2 Republican saying, we will not challenge the results of the election, Mo Brooks will be very hard pressed, to say the least, to find a partner on the Senate side who's a Republican who will agree to challenge the results of the presidential election.
Great, thanks, John. That's clarifying, and the perspective from 2016 is helpful too. Thank you.
So let's move on to the popular vote. The popular vote, as you can see, we don't choose our presidents by popular vote. We choose them by the Electoral College. That's why Peter just asked that particular question. The popular vote in 2016, you see Hillary Clinton won by nearly 3 million votes, 2.8 million votes over Donald Trump. I'm sure to this day, it galls her. I've heard her talk about the 2016 election and not in positive terms, because she did win the popular vote by running up her totals, particularly in California. You fast forward 4 years to the 2020 election, and actually this number also is a little old. The margin of victory by Joe Biden over Donald Trump is now over 7 million. 7 million. Joe Biden, the vote totals over the past few weeks have been counted and nearly complete. Joe Biden has surpassed 80 million votes. President Trump has surpassed 74 million votes, both records. But obviously, Joe Biden holds the record because he beat President Trump in the popular vote total. Again, the reason, huge vote margins of victory by the Biden-Harris ticket in California, where Biden won by over 25% over Donald Trump, and also large margins in New York and Illinois, two other very populous states here in the U.S. So that gives you a sense about what this election really was all about and how energized the electorate was, that we had record numbers coming out to vote. We had well over 66% of those eligible to vote voting in this presidential election. That's a record that has not been seen in modern times. And that gives you a sense about the energy that existed not only for President Trump, but also the energy that existed that was against President Trump, that the Trump campaign clearly didn't see. They didn't see that because, as you know, Joe Biden, unlike President Trump, didn't hold those campaign rallies during the course of because of the pandemic. The next slide is my final slide, and this looks ahead. These are the areas that
John,
I think. Yeah.
Before we go to this last slide, maybe we can I have a couple of questions that on the, on the actual elections, if we could just stick with that for just a moment.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
One of them was, just on the Senate election in Georgia, what's that look like? I think people are having a difficult time understanding which polls to trust, and particularly if Trump currently does damage or good from a Republican standpoint. So what's your take on the Georgia runoff?
Well, that's a really good question. So it's a good question, Steve, because the 2020 election isn't over yet. There's still a runoff election that will happen with 2 Senate seats, and those 2 Senate seats will determine who controls the U.S. Senate. And it's a big deal, obviously, because as things stand right now, Democrats control the White House in 2021. They control the House of Representatives in 2021. And they have the possibility, if they win both Senate seats, of getting to 50-50 with Vice President Harris breaking the tie. And it would also mean that Democrats would control all of the senatorial committees as well. So you asked me, how do things look? Well, it's really close. I look at the same polls that you do. A great site to look at polls, I think I mentioned this in our first webinar, is realclearpolitics.com. If you go to the upper left of that particular site, you can click on polls and you can see the latest polls for both Senate races in Georgia. And right now, it's essentially within the margin of error for both of those Senate races. For both Republicans who are hoping to win full 6-year terms, they're in for the run of their lives. President Trump traveled down to Georgia for a campaign rally on Saturday. And the question is, and it goes to your question, Steve, does the president help or hurt the cause of those Republican candidates? And the reason why people say that is because when he goes down to these rallies, yes, he talks about the candidates that are running for these full 6-year terms, but he spends the bulk of his time talking about himself and talking about how unfair the process was, how the election was rife with fraud. And the fear is among Republicans is that this will lower turnout among Republicans in the upcoming runoff. That is a huge fear because, as we all know, whether you're talking about any of the Nordic countries or any country around the world for that matter, elections and winning elections all comes down to turnout. And so you want to get all of the Republicans, certainly they came out to vote on November the 3rd, to come out and vote again on January the 5th. And you want the numbers to actually increase, if that's possible, to come out and vote on January the 5th. So it's so hard, Steve, to weigh in and say who's going to win those runoffs. And you have to figure that whoever wins, it's going to be two Republicans or two Democrats, because I can't imagine voters splitting their tickets when so much is at stake. You know, you either want to have the Senate in control of Republicans, or you want to have the Senate in control of Democrats if you're a voter. And that's why the feeling is that people will, you know, pull the lever for both Republican candidates or pull the lever for both Democratic candidates rather than split their tickets. If indeed there are ticket splitters, that would put the Senate in control of Republicans. It would remain in control. Mitch McConnell would remain the leader of the Senate, which is Republican Senate once, obviously, and that's the reason why you have pretty much every Republican senator at some point between November the 3rd and January the 5th traveling down to Georgia to campaign for each of these Republican candidates. They want to do all they can to help them out, and there is a record amount of money that's being raised for these races. If you happen to turn on your television in Georgia at any moment of the day, all you're seeing is campaign commercials. That's it. You know, the election for most of the country, for all of the country, has been over since November the 3rd. No more campaign commercials, thankfully. But the campaign hasn't ended for Georgians. They are still seeing them around the clock. So I hope that provides a little bit of insight for you, Steve.
Absolutely. And I think, Alexander, you have a question to come in with?
Yeah, I actually had a follow-up question on that, because, you know, one of the questions in the chat is a really great one about how campaigns mobilized voters in 2020, because, you know, traditional canvassing is all about door knocking. Right. And now we've moved into this COVID 2020 era of campaigning. But when it comes to Georgia, how are the parties actually mobilizing the voters to go out there and vote, as opposed to sort of, you know, saying they did their part and leaving it to others? Because as many commercials as they put at them, it really just matters who shows up. Well, that's right. And so this was a problem that faced both political parties in the presidential election. Alexandra, you know, how do you get everybody to go out to vote when it's not normal times? There's a pandemic going on. Well, interestingly enough, there was still door knocking that occurred with both political parties leading up to the 2020 election, maybe not as much as we saw in the past. That is continuing, you know, to a certain extent in the Georgia races. I mentioned television. There's also radio, and there's also internet ads that are running as well. And you know, it's also one of those things where if you watch the news, this leads the newscasts in Georgia. I speak to our affiliates in Georgia pretty regularly, and they tell me that there's been one senatorial debate that took place on Sunday, this past Sunday. It involved the race of Kelly Loeffler versus Reverend Warnock, her opponent. And I think that's it. I don't think we'll see any more debates between now and January 5th. But make no mistake about it, Alexandra, everybody in the state of Georgia knows full well when election day is for the runoff. It's January the 5th. Everybody knows that. They see that in yard signs. They're getting inundated with phone calls from phone banks that have been set up, all trying to convince voters to show up. And also, let's not forget, people have their mobiles, their cell phones, and they're getting text messages from the campaigns as well. So I was going to say, let me put you on the spot then, because you very accurately, when you were with us, predicted, you know, what were the battleground states, what states to watch. Yeah. Who do you think is going to walk away with Georgia? Who do you think is going to win in Georgia? Which way is the state going to swing? Yeah, you're putting me on the spot. And no, I appreciate that. So there are two races, and I said that most people are just going to pull the lever for one candidate or another.
the thing that makes it so difficult for me to weigh in is because of the question that was asked about, does President Trump help or hurt the cause? Does President Trump railing against the system, talking about the unfounded claim that there was fraud in the presidential election, does that hurt turnout for the runoff? I don't know. No one knows that. No one obviously knows what turnout is going to be. That being said, if I had to say who's going to win these two races, I'd say David Perdue is likely to win this particular race against Ossoff. Ossoff being the Democrat, Perdue being the Republican. Actually, let me flip that. I'm glad I'm checking myself. I think Ossoff is more likely to win his particular race, and Kelly Loeffler is likely to win her particular race. But again, it comes down to turnout. If I'm wrong, it wouldn't surprise me, and that's why I don't think that you've seen anyone say with a definitive in a definitive way who's going to win this election. And you may also know this already, Alexandra, as it relates to the presidential election. The pollsters got things so wrong. There was a poll that came out within 1 week of the presidential election by ABC News, well respected. I have very good friends that work at ABC News, but the poll showed that Joe Biden was going to win the state of Wisconsin by 17 points. And that was not the case. As if we were to flip back to a number of slides, which we don't have to do, you can see that it was just a 20,000 vote margin that Joe Biden won that state by. So polls, I think in this day and age are not proven to be that accurate or reflective of what actually happens in terms of the results. Would I be surprised if we have another recount for these two races? No, I wouldn't. After what we saw happen in the presidential race and what happened with the Senate races, the reason why we have runoffs right now happening on January the 5th is because no candidate managed to exceed the 50% threshold. Now it's down to two candidates, and obviously I think one or the other in both races will surpass that 50% threshold. But having said that, would I be surprised to see recounts in the races? No, I won't be. And that means that maybe on January the 6th, the day after the election, we still won't know for certain who controls the U.S. Senate over the course of the next 2 years. That's what we're talking about.
Well, thank you, John. And speaking of the next 2 years, I would look forward to hearing your thoughts on the Biden-Harris administration priority. Thank you so much.
Thanks for make that segue. Very appreciative. Great job. So I broke this down because there are certain industries that are important to focus on. And let me go through them as quickly as possible so we have time for questions. And I mentioned this yesterday. If we need to go over by 15 minutes, more than happy to do so we can get to any questions that you may have. So on foreign policy, I'm sure that if you watch the news or read the papers in any of your countries, you know, this is probably the focus more than anything else before they get into the weeds here with some of these various sectors. On foreign policy, the Biden administration will rebuild ties that have been frayed during the Trump administration. The ties have been frayed between Europe and the U.S., between the U.S. and NATO, between the U.S. and the World Health Organization. And we know this because Joe Biden campaigned on that. We know this because Joe Biden, since becoming president-elect, has reemphasized this point. And we know this because Joe Biden, in putting together and naming his foreign policy team so far, they're internationalists. They're individuals that worked in the at very high levels. Tony Blinken will serve as the Secretary of State. He will be confirmed. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, she'll be confirmed by a huge bipartisan margin. She's so well respected. But I believe that what we're likely to see is a reaching out between the U.S. and Europe. And you may have seen just the other day, European foreign ministers actually extended that hand, so to speak, to the U.S., saying they want to work with the U.S., which sometimes they've been rebuffed by the administration on so many different issues, whether you're talking about foreign policy or trade policy. So certainly we can expect that over the course of the next 4 years. On energy, Joe Biden campaigned on a climate agenda. This is an important aspect of his administration. We've seen this so far in policy pronouncements that Joe Biden has made. It's an aggressive climate agenda. It orders the U.S. back into the Paris Climate Change Accord. That will be something that Joe Biden will certainly do within his first 100 days in office, I have no doubt. Starting negotiations for new climate, that will be, and the EPA will focus on the Environmental Protection Agency, and also slowing or maybe even halting oil leasing on federal lands. That's another thing that we can expect in a Biden administration. Corporate taxes. You are all interested in that. Every AmCham member is focused on, well, what does this mean for corporate taxes? What does the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris mean for this particular issue? I think that you are likely to see a rate increase, but it all depends on the Senate, as we were just talking about. If Republicans maintain control over the U.S. Senate, well, that will be a roadblock in terms of what the Biden administration may want to do as it relates to tax policy, which was changed remarkably so in the first year of the Trump administration. So let's talk specifics. Joe Biden has proposed increasing the corporate tax rate to 28%. He's proposed imposing a new minimum tax on U.S. companies, and he's also proposed raising taxes on the foreign income of many U.S.-based multinational corporations. All things he'd like to do, but will he be able to do them? And if the Senate remains in Republican hands, I think it will be. Whether we're talking about one or both races that Republicans will win, I think that, and Democrats have to win both. I think that the Senate, this goes to Alexandra's question, I think the Senate ultimately will remain in Republican hands, but not by much, which means they can't afford to lose any of their Republican members to some of these ideas that may be put forward as it relates to taxes by the Biden administration. On autos, there's going to be a push for tougher fuel economy regulations for automakers. This is something that's really important. This is something that an administration can do without Congress. You can do this through the rulemaking process. This is what the Trump administration did on so many issues. And winning control of the White House means that you win control of those policymakers at the EPA, for instance, and you can change the rules. And that's what we saw the Obama administration do when they changed rules that were in place for the George W. Bush administration. They were changed under the Trump administration, and they'll likely be changed again with a Biden administration. So that's what we can expect in the auto sector. On technology, it's important to keep in mind that the vice president, the incoming vice president, is from California. She is an ally of the tech sector. She has always been an ally of the tech sector from when she was a district attorney in San Francisco to an attorney general in California and a senator from California and soon to be the vice president of the United States. I would not be surprised to see President Biden name her as essentially the point person for Silicon Valley. And with big tech having that ally in the White House, it's good news as it relates to H-1B visas. The industry, as you know, relies significantly on immigrant talent, and H-1B visas are the way to get that talent. The number of permitted H-1B visas has decreased significantly during the Trump administration. We're going to see that number increase, I would think, significantly during the Biden administration. On manufacturing, we know that there's been a trade tariffs policy imposed over the course of the past 4 years by President Trump. We're going to see an easing of those trade tariffs and trade restrictions, and maybe ultimately an elimination of them altogether. I would predict that in the first year, certainly the threats of trade tariffs goes away with Joe Biden in the White House. In addition, I would think also within the first year, a lot of those trade tariffs that were placed upon European goods also go away. Not without some negotiation. Don't get me wrong. They just don't go away without some sort of give and take between the US and the EU. But it's a friendly negotiation. And that, to me, is good news for European countries that do business in the US. They don't have to worry in terms of their planning about the possibility of tariffs being imposed by the United States, something they've always worried about with the Trump administration. More regulation is what we can expect as it relates to the agriculture industry. Farmers are girding for a return of that. On banking, multinational banks really have to be focused on something that really focuses on domestic banking, and that is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That was stood up during the Obama administration. It was decreased in importance during the Trump administration, and you're going to see it once again increase its relevance during the Biden administration. Payday lenders will be certainly targeted by the CFPB, as will debt collectors. This is an administration, the Biden administration, that will certainly reach out to consumers as opposed to, which the focus of the Trump administration really has been Wall Street more than Main Street. And lastly, the pharmaceutical industry. It's also a focus of European-based pharmaceutical companies, and during a pandemic, its importance has taken on a greater role. And here, I don't think that we're going to see much difference, interestingly enough, between the policies of the Trump administration versus the pharmaceutical industry and the policies of the Biden administration in this particular sector. There will be renewed efforts by Joe Biden, the president, to lower the cost of prescription drugs. But that's why I say no difference, because that's something that President Trump has also focused on during his term as president. Joe Biden has also proposed the government directly negotiate with drug makers for discounts on medications. Medicare can't do that right now under the current law. So we may see some changes in that regard. But what Joe Biden obviously inherits on January the 20th is a pandemic here in the US, which of course you're dealing with in each of your countries. And he'll also be inheriting this process of figuring out how to distribute the COVID-19 vaccine first, like your countries are, frontline workers and those most vulnerable, and then getting that COVID-19 vaccine out to the general population. So hopefully that gives you a good overview about what we can expect in the Biden administration. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions to sort of drill down to any specifics that you may have.
Thanks, John. Excellent presentation, and really appreciate your insights. You certainly opened up a lot of doors on that one, so there's a lot of questions. So I'm going to rely on my Nordic colleagues to show their hands so they can kind of help me ask these questions to you. And so stick with us, and like I say, we'll keep an eye on the time and see how we're doing. But right now I've got one from Jason. So Jason, you want to chime in with us?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, John, especially your last slide covered a lot of ground, and really appreciate that of importance to a lot of our members here. A lot of potential work to be done by this administration, and we touched upon it earlier in your presentation. But in terms of the Biden administration being able to work productively with Congress to get a lot of this stuff done, right, that remains to be seen. If you wouldn't mind, maybe talking a bit about the new and burgeoning Problem Solvers Caucus, 50-person bipartisan caucus that is alleged to have moved the needle significantly, at least with COVID-19 relief negotiations. Are we going to see, and my interpretation is that this is a good sign that groups like this have increased kind of, clout going forward. What's the potential for bipartisan collaboration going forward? Thank you.
It's a great question, Jason. And the reason why it's a great question is because of the realities of the margins that will exist in the new Congress. So for the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi will still be the Speaker of the House for the next 2 years, starting in January. But her margin, Democrats' margin over Republicans, has been reduced. It was an interesting election because obviously people split their tickets. They didn't want to give full power essentially to Democrats, and they wanted perhaps a check on a Joe Biden administration. And because of that, the Problem Solvers Caucus takes on a greater role, greater importance. And we saw that, as you mentioned, Jason, with the COVID-19 relief bill, which seems to have been embraced by some hardliners on both sides, the far left and the far right. And that's an important thing in terms of moving any type of legislation forward. Compromise is so important. That's the House. On the Senate side, regardless of what happens in those runoff elections in Georgia, it's going to be essentially a divided Senate. It's 51-49, 50-50. It's a divided Senate with 50-48. Those are the possibilities. And as a result, some of the more moderate members of the Senate really gain a lot of new power. So Joe Manchin, he's from West Virginia. He's a Democrat. He sometimes votes with Republicans. He voted for the president's 2 of his 3 nominees for the Supreme Court and broke with his party. He's someone to keep an eye on the Democratic side. And on the Republican side, Susan Collins, who was just reelected to a full 6-year term in the Senate. She's a moderate Republican from Maine, sometimes breaks with her party, as does Lisa Murkowski. That is another moderate from Alaska who sometimes breaks with her party. So to your question, there will be ample opportunities for the Problem Solvers Caucus to wield their power and influence. And I think that this is going to be an interesting 2 years, Jason, because the moderates will, for the first time in, I would say, a decade or two, actually have some influence in trying to move legislation forward that makes sense for the middle part of America, not the America that's on the far left or on the far right.
Thank you, John.
And I think, Peter, you have a question?
Yes. So I have a 2-part question. The one, I guess, maybe is easier than the other, but both related to your last slide, John, which was a great summation of what might come. So one of Washington's favorite inside the Beltway parlor games is trying to suss out who's going to be in the new cabinet and the new cabinet or near cabinet level positions that are important for us and our members are yet to be named at Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative. So the first part of my question is if you have any insights into whether Biden might reach across the aisle for someone like, I don't know, Meg Whitman to be the Secretary of Commerce, for example, or what he might be thinking about at USTR. And this would have implications for, whether what the U.S. does with regard to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is a question in the chat here, and also with the potential reopening towards Europe and the TTIP or Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement. And then the second question is foreign policy related and also from the chat, and maybe easier to suss out because we know who the Secretary of State's going to be, and that is what would be the new administration's take or their policy position vis-a-vis Iran.
Yeah, so excellent questions. And I see another one that I want to get to as well as it relates to China in the chat. So let me also get to that as well. So I don't have any names for you as it relates to USTR, U.S. Trade Representative. Meg Whitman, well-respected possibility. But here's the problem with naming a Republican in the Biden administration. You will have so many upset Democrats who work so hard for Joe Biden and maybe have their eyes set on being the USTR. They've worked hard for the Biden campaign. They've maybe raised a significant amount of money for the Biden campaign, and they want a reward. That's always what happens in politics, whether you're talking about Republican politics or Democratic politics. So that will be the difficult thing if Meg Whitman, a name, again, who's well respected in politics and certainly in Silicon Valley, were to be named the USTR, which requires Senate confirmation. I don't think she would have any difficulty in terms of Senate confirmation. But I have not heard her name specifically other than what you just mentioned. And the difficulty there is just how do you get over the disappointment that some Democrats may have that they're not being included in a very important role, a cabinet level role in a Biden administration. You mentioned a number of trade deals that the Trump administration essentially pulled out of. TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, a multilateral trade deal involving the US and Europe. These are two trade agreements that I would be optimistic about the Biden administration pursuing. The Trump administration pulled out of these trade negotiations in large part because President Trump has and did express the view that he does not like multilateral trade deals. He likes bilateral trade deals. And an example of that is an agreement that was reached early on in the Trump administration between the US and South Korea. So multilateral trade deals were never going to happen in a Trump administration. In a Biden administration, they make sense, especially when you consider the people that have already been named as a part of the Biden foreign policy team, including Antony Blinken. He is someone who served as the Deputy Secretary of State. He is someone who served as the National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. He is someone who was quite supportive of these efforts that were being undertaken by the Obama administration. So I could certainly see efforts being pursued in that vein during a Biden administration. And I would not be surprised, Peter, if in the first 100 days we see an announcement coming in regards to both of those trade negotiations. After all, China, I wanted to get to China, and I will get to Iran as well. But China is really a very important issue, no matter who won the presidential election. And if you followed the election really closely, and I know all of you did, you would have noticed there was very little daylight between what Joe Biden was saying about China and what President Trump was saying about China. I don't think that the Biden administration, lets up on the gas pedal in any way in terms of the way it views China. China is an economic adversary. It's an adversary in other ways as well. And what you're likely to see, I think, in a Biden administration is cooperation, which never existed between the US and the European Union in terms of their approach towards China. I never understood this. It seems to me that the two largest economies in the world combined would have so much leverage over China, and the Trump administration never took advantage of that. I think the Biden administration will. And, will relations improve to a certain extent? Maybe. After all, you won't hear Joe Biden talking about the coronavirus as the Wuhan virus or the China virus, which obviously clearly upset the Chinese leadership, President Xi. So in that respect, it will be different. But in terms of policy, I don't think we're going to see that much of a difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Certainly, you're not going to see trade tariffs being removed. Like I said, they will likely be removed as it relates to European products on Chinese products anytime soon. There will have to be a negotiation to go down that road. And lastly, Peter, you mentioned Iran. We know that Joe Biden campaigned supporting the Iran nuclear deal, which obviously took place during the Obama administration. He supported it as vice president. I think that there will be an effort to re-engage with Iran during Joe Biden's 4 years in office. And maybe that will lead to some sort of re-engagement of the U.S. into the Iran nuclear deal. I think that there is certainly that would be welcomed by the other partners in the Iran nuclear deal. And as far as the rhetoric that exists between the U.S. and Iran, it may be tamped down a little bit, but we've even seen, Peter, in just since the election, more sanctions, if it was even possible, more sanctions imposed upon Iran by the U.S. Will those sanctions be removed? Well, again, not without some sort of give and take between negotiators from both sides. The Biden administration does not want to seem weak towards Iran, and that's the reason why those types of negotiations will likely have to ramp up during the first 6 months or so of the Biden administration.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Peter, for that question. I think we're good to go. And we're at 3, but we're going to, John, thank you for the opportunity to continue on a little bit. I think we do have a few more things to round out here. So, Alexander, you want to come in with your question?
There we go. Sure. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us. If you need to leave, we completely understand. It's such a treat to have John with us. So I'm just going to plow right into the question I had, which is on Monday I actually had a conversation on the radio about how the Republican Party is reacting to Trump's refusal to concede, and whether or not this is really going to affect President-elect Biden's transfer and start in his first days in office. And so I'd love to ask from your perspective, what do you think that for the next few years, the way the Republican Party is acting right now with President Trump refusing to concede, how that will play out, and whether or not this sort of break from tradition, one might say, will meaningfully affect President-elect Biden's first administration?
Well, it's a great question, and it's important to remind all of your members of what happened 4 years ago on Inauguration Day for President Trump. And that is, there were actually a few dozen Democratic members of Congress who boycotted the inauguration of President Trump. So this is not the first time that this type of thing has happened. John Lewis, who was a hero in the civil rights movement, who passed away over the summer, was one of the most prominent members of the Congress who boycotted the inauguration of President Trump. He said that he did not view him as a legitimate president. And we hear those same words coming from Republicans right now as it relates to Joe Biden. Again, without any proof, it must be stressed over and over again. This was a free and fair election in the U.S., and Joe Biden won 306 electoral votes. I showed you how many popular votes that he won in the country, over 80 million. This was an election that energized both sides. If there was a normal inauguration, meaning if we had the same number of people that we typically see at an inauguration, I think that right there in the inauguration platform would be the leaders of both the House and the Senate, which means that Mitch McConnell would be right behind Joe Biden while he's being sworn in as President of the United States. Mitch McConnell is an institutionalist. He not only put together a bipartisan resolution during the course of the campaign that was supported unanimously, rarely see that in the Senate, which said that there will be a peaceful transition of power on January the 20th. So Republicans and Democrats came together. When President Trump was asked the question during the campaign, would you support a peaceful transition of power? And he was reluctant to ask that question. Literally a day later, Mitch McConnell put together a resolution that was supported by Republicans and Democrats in the Senate that supports that idea that has always existed in America. Will there be, Alexandra, individuals on the Republican side, particularly in the House, that will not acknowledge that President-elect Trump is president on January the 20th, like Mel Brooks? Absolutely. Like a Congressman from Arizona named Paul Gosar? Yes, absolutely. But they're on the fringes. And I think that once the Electoral College meets on December the 14th, which is on Monday of next week, you're going to see more Republicans come forward and say, Joe Biden is president-elect. So this is, I think, a reflection of Republicans being reluctant to in any way feel the wrath on Twitter from President Trump that they certainly would feel if they came out full force and talked about President-elect Joe Biden. But you're going to see more of that, I think, next week after the Electoral College meets. And you'll see even more of that on January the 5th of 2021, once Congress essentially certifies the vote. And so hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely.
Good.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And there's a question in the chat, but Stephen, maybe you want to take it. I was going to say it's about big tech regulation in the EU and the ripple over effects to the US. It's been a busy year when it comes to digital service taxes, Privacy Shield, Schrems 2. Is that something that you follow, or how do you have predictions around that for the Biden administration?
Well, I think the Biden administration will be more favorable to big tech than the Trump administration was. You've seen the effort by the Department of Justice to go after big tech, particularly Google and Facebook, which they view somehow as being very partisan against Republicans. Investigations into big tech that we've seen, similar to what we've seen in the European Union. Will that continue in the Biden administration? I think that the investigations will certainly continue. They're being done by professional prosecutors at the Department of Justice. They're not just being done by political appointees. So the investigations will continue, but those investigations could lead to no prosecution agreements being sought after any tech companies. I can't get inside, what the DOJ may ultimately do, because like you, I have no idea what evidence they may uncover. But I think you're going to see, as I mentioned in my presentation, an ally that exists in the White House with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, similar to what we saw with Barack Obama. Although Barack Obama and the Obama administration was really, I think, if you look back on those 8 years that the Obama administration had in power, they were really, for the most part, hands off entirely with Silicon Valley. They just let Silicon Valley do their thing. One reason was Silicon Valley, let's face it, they were raising a lot of money for Democrats in the Obama White House, and I think there was an appreciation for that. Will that exist during the 4 years of the Biden administration? I don't think it's going to be as hands off. We don't know who the new Attorney General is going to be for President Biden. I've seen Jay Johnson, his name being mentioned. He's a possibility, very well respected. He's actually a friend, and I don't even try emailing him now since the election because he's gone to speak. He's not going to respond to an email. But I would not be surprised if he's certainly in the running to be the Attorney General in the Biden administration. He has served on some corporate boards. I think that if I'm not mistaken, he's been on the board of Uber. So that is his connection to the tech industry. But I think that he would be certainly supported on a bipartisan basis. So I know I covered a lot of ground there in that answer, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight about what we could expect with Joe Biden as president.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. I think it's time to kind of wrap up here. I have a couple of just very final questions for you. One on the EU-US relationship, because, back in Obama's time, it was said that, Europe finally got the president they always wished for, but they had nothing to offer him, right? And right. So in a way, Biden, now Europe's finally got a president that they can deal with. But at the end of the day, they came out with their plan. But do you think they have enough and that they can get their act together to really give something meaningful to Biden because again, the perception that the EU is constantly just trying to overregulate, and go their rules and not the US rules. So thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that initially there's going to be, within the first 100 days, a breaking of bread between the US and the EU, which will be just symbolic, just to show that the US has a different attitude towards our European partners, our European allies, than the Trump administration did. And that will be important. That'll be important in terms of just setting the table for what may happen over the next 4 years. And so, you know, to a certain extent, Steve, that symbolism does go a long way, as you know, in terms of just trying to get some sort of an agreement reached, particularly in the area of trade. That is an area that we were going down a fine path, you would argue, with the Obama administration, with TTIP. As I mentioned in the presentation, I would not be surprised if those types of negotiations are resumed in the Biden administration. But you also have to keep in mind something, Steve, that Biden campaigned on and Joe Biden has spoken of since the November 3rd election. He too, it seemed like he tore a page from the Trump playbook to a certain extent, has spoken about focusing on American industry. I don't think he talked about the idea of America first, which has negative connotations, but it's the concept of the US does need to look out for American jobs, and the Biden administration will look out for American jobs. So what that tells me is that there will be a breaking of bread, but the Biden administration is not going to be a patsy. They're not going to, you know, give the store away to Europe. They want to make certain that any deals that are consummated are fair deals in terms of the U.S. labor market and fair deals in terms of the area that means a lot to this new incoming administration, climate change. And I think that the fact that Joe Biden has spoken of wanting to have open arms in terms of meeting with the European Union, perhaps even halfway, on a number of trade issues, on the issue of climate change, gives me optimism that the members that are on this webinar have a lot to look forward to in terms of economic cooperation that will exist over the next 4 years.
Fantastic, John. On that note, I think let's wrap up. So, John, thanks so much for being with us. It's been an extremely interesting and relevant discussion. We really appreciate that you spent time with us and shared your unique insight with us. So we look again forward to engaging with you soon. So we'll keep the relationship going. And also, just to my AmCham colleagues, Peter from Sweden, Alexander from Finland, and Jason from Norway, thanks for such a great partnership. It's such great to have you guys on and have our members on. And let me just say, on behalf of all of us, to all of our members that are still on the line, thanks for your support, and we look forward to a great 2021. So stick with us. That wraps up for today. Thanks for everybody for joining, and do stay safe. Thank you.